GDP and economic growth. GDP stands for gross domestic product. It tells us about the total market value of all final goods and services which are produced annually within the borders of a country or within the territorial boundaries of a country. It includes all the goods and services which are produced by either citizen supplied. By citizen supplied, I mean which are produced by the people of your own country, or the foreign supplied resources employed within your country who are foreigners but working in your own country. It tells us the market value of all final goods and services which are produced either by the citizens of the country or by the foreigners of the country within the territorial boundaries of that country. Now, this GDP measure is a monetary measure. Why we call it a monetary measure? For example, if there are 3 sofas and 2 computers which are produced in 1 year, so we will not say that 3 sofas and 2 computers in 1 year is the GDP. Why? Because maybe in the next year 2 sofas and 3 computers are produced in the year 2. How can we determine that which value is the highest? In order to determine that, in order to answer this question, we assign monetary value to the production of sofas and to the production of computers. Then we assign a monetary value. Let's say it's written here that the annual output is in year 1 is 3 sofas and 2 computers. 3 sofas are costing 500, or the value of 3 sofas is 500, 2 computers 2000. So the market value of this output is 5500. Whereas of this output, it becomes this much, that is 7000. So we can easily differentiate that what is the actual value, actual GDP of this output and of this output. Prices may change. Over here you see 3 sofas are of 500, over here 2 sofas are of 500. Prices may change, but since we assign some monetary value in terms of money, so it becomes that is why we say we call GDP a monetary measure, because we assign monetary weights to the production. Then second is we avoid multiple counting in GDP. What is a multiple counting concept? There are 2 types of goods: intermediate goods and final goods. The intermediate goods are those goods which are ready for purchase and sale for further manufacturing. It's written here, products that are purchased for resale, or goods and services that are purchased for resale for further processing or manufacturing. Intermediate goods are also known as the inputs. For example, the wheat is the output in the agriculture sector, but wheat becomes an input in the industry when we make flour out of it. Then there are final goods. Final goods are those goods which are ready and they are ready for use by the consumers or by the users. In GDP, while calculating GDP, we consider the value of final goods. We do not consider the value of intermediate goods. Maybe now, how do we measure that? How do we do that? Let me show you. For instance, wheat is an output, and the output of value of output of wheat is 200. Now when we make flour out of this wheat, and if this is calculated in, if this we say is a part of GDP, and when we use this wheat to make flour and the flour is sold for 400, this is also GDP, or the value of flour is 400. Then if we calculate 200 and 400, the GDP becomes 600, whereas it is not 600. Why it is not 600? Because in this 400, this 200 is included. If we will add this 200 and this 400 again, it would be a multiple counting. We have already calculated 200, and here the value of the flour by using the wheat as an input becomes 400. So 200 is the value of wheat. 200 in this case is the value of wheat as well, because we have paid 200 to get this wheat and to bring it here to make it flour. So to avoid, in order to avoid multiple counting, either we take the value of all final goods and services, or in, if not, then we take the value addition. For instance, here it costs 200, here it becomes 400, the value addition is 200 in the case of flour. So if we calculate this and if we calculate this, GDP becomes 400. If we calculate this and we calculate whole of it, it becomes 600, which is a multiple counting because this 200 is included in this 400. So we avoid multiple counting. GDP excludes the second-hand sales. If you sell your car to a friend in 1965 and that car is produced in 1960, the value of the car is calculated in the GDP of 1960. It cannot be calculated again in the value of the GDP of 1965, because the car it becomes a second-hand product in 1965. If there is a car which is sold for the first time, produced for the first time and sold in 2020, its value is calculated in the GDP of 2020. Its value is not would not be calculated if it is resold in 2021. That reselling is not calculated in the GDP of 2021. It also includes exclude financial transactions. Why it excludes financial transactions? The reason behind is that all the financial transactions, they are just a piece of paper. For example, bond, for example, stocks, they are not the real money. That is why we exclude financial transactions from GDP. Now, how do we measure GDP? There are two methods of measuring GDP. One method is the expenditure method. Other method is the uh, income method. There are two methods of measuring GDP. This measurement of GDP is the expenditure method of measuring GDP. The expenditure method of measuring GDP is based upon this model. Consumption, investment, government spending, exports and imports. First is consumption. All the expenditures, since we are studying expenditure method of measuring GDP, all the expenditures by the households for the purpose of buying a product to consume it, that becomes personal consumption expenditures. It can be expenditures by households on durable goods, non-durable goods, on consumer expenditures for services, for example, lawyers, doctors, mechanics. Next is the gross private domestic investment. All the expenditures which are made on these three things. on all final purchases of machinery, equipment, and tools by business enterprises. If money is spent on these purposes, that is gross private domestic investment. All the money spent, all the expenditures made on construction, and changes in inventories, all the money spent on changes in the inventories. What are the changes in inventories? There are positive and negative changes in inventories. Suppose inventories accumulation of stock. Suppose inventories rose by 10 billion between 31st to 2010 to 31st December 2011. Now the change in inventory in this case is 10 billion. You see, there is 10 billion change in inventory. When there is 10 billion change in inventory, that means investment in this case is 10 billion. This is positive change in inventory. When we say this is positive change in inventory, then that is taken as an investment. If there is a negative change in inventory, how is that? For instance, the inventory came down by 10 billion, that is negative change in inventory, that is not part of investment. Then non-investment transactions, they are not a part of the investment. And in investment, there is gross investment. Gross is, it includes all final purchases of machinery, all construction, and all changes in inventories. Total of it. The word private and domestic means that we are speaking of spending private businesses, not government. This is all the investment which is done by the private people, and there is no inclusion of government. And that the investment is taking place inside the country, not abroad. That is why we are saying it is domestic. Why we are saying it is private? It is done by the private people, not the government. This is in gross domestic private investment. Then is government purchases. Government purchases, government expenditures on final goods and services, publicly owned capital. There are two expenditures. Expenditures for the goods and services that government consumes in providing public services. For example, salaries of the employees of the government. Second, expenditures for publicly owned capital such as schools, highways, which have long lifetimes. The first, this type of expenditure is known as non-development expenditure. This type of an expenditure is known as development expenditure. If government consumes something or spends something on the goods and services in order to provide public services, that is development expenditure. If government spends something for publicly owned capital for the schools and highways, hospitals, uh, for the betterment of the people, if government spends, that is known as this non-development expenditure. Last is net exports. Net exports is exports minus the imports. Exports, that we earn money by sending something abroad and we earn something. Imports, that we buy from some other country and we pay for those products. Net exports, exports minus the imports. If exports are higher and imports are lower, we say that exports are in surplus, or we say there is positive net exports. If exports are lower and imports are higher, we say net exports are negative in nature. There is a trade deficit. This is the GDP model which we have just discussed. This is the model of GDP based upon the expenditure approach. This is the calculation of GDP. If we, this is consumption, this is investment, this is government spending. This minus 79, minus 579 is showing that there is a trade deficit in this case. Minus means imports are higher and exports are lower. How much imports are higher? This much are $579 or billion dollars are higher. This is the expenditure approach to measure GDP.